Here, thank you for your patience. We're trying to give some stragglers a minute to come in. Appreciate everybody choosing to spend your evening here this evening. We have Dr. David Parker. That's going to be talking shortly about what he's found about the effects of nonpartisan election on voter turnout. This is the monthly meeting of the Gallatin Democrats, the Central Committee. We normally meet Wednesdays at the Labor Temple over on Mendenhall. Feel free to come on by. It is a very friendly group of people, very approachable. We're excited tonight to be co-hosting this with the Montana State Democrats. Very excited about the opportunity to bring the two groups together. And I think it's so important for all these organizations to form a cohesive unit going forward, especially for next year. I think most of you probably saw a sign up out here, email, phone number, social. If you don't know what to do, we would love to suggest a few things. We have a lot of actionable items for every personality type. If you are an extrovert, there are things you can do. If you're an introvert and want to hide in the back room in a dark corner with creating content and crunching numbers, there are those jobs as well. Every hour is crucial. Every hour matters. Every dollar matters. And we've got to just show up for next year. At our meeting last month, I heard something that really resonated with me. There was a lady that said that she had heard in life that it is just the people that show up that run everything. All we got to do is show up, and we've got to show up so that we can get more people to show up in 2020. And this is a good start. One specific ask we have coming up as far as the dollars, we are planning for a fundraiser in February. Some of you probably remember the event that we had a couple of years ago at the Rialto. The candidate debate was a very successful event. We had a lot of people show up. We raised a lot of money, and we got a lot of Democrats elected in Gallatin County and the state, and honestly moved the needle on the federal election as well. So again, glad you're here tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Cameron, introduce Dr. Parker, and thank you all for your time and your efforts.
Hi, everybody. I'm Cameron Kretz. I am the president of the Montana Federation of College Democrats. I'm going to be introducing Dr. Parker tonight because one of his students, and I was asked to do so, so let's do this. So, Dr. David Parker is the current head of the Political Science Department here at MSU. He's also the author of Battle for the Big Sky, Representation and the Politics of Place in the Race for the U.S. Senate. It's a really good book, and you guys should all read it. Go out there, go read it. Little plug for you, Dr. Parker. Then he's also someone I look up to as a teacher, a mentor, and a political scientist. I went with him this summer to the UK, just on our little British politics trip. Learned a lot about Brexit and what's going on over there. Because I don't know if you guys know, but Britain's also kind of a mess right now. So, like mother, like daughter. So we are super grateful to have him here with us to discuss the questionable attempt to make Gallatin County elections nonpartisan. So without further ado, Dr. Parker.
So before I start, I think it's a good time to share what people tell me when they find out I'm a political scientist. I usually get one of two responses. The first response is, oh, you're a political scientist. You want to run for office, right? And I look at them and I said, no, I want to study them. I don't want to be them. No, thank you very much. The second thing that they say is, invariably, this actually happened this morning when my neighbor found out I was a political scientist. Oh, it must be a really interesting time to be a political scientist. Well, frankly, for me, yes, it's always interesting to be a political scientist because I really love what I do. However, I would say that perhaps at this precise moment, given the events of the last 48 hours, both in the United States and the UK, both of which I study, it is an interesting time to be a political scientist. So yes, I can affirm that. So what I'd like to do today is to talk a little bit about nonpartisan elections. Now, I'm not going to talk about my research. I haven't done research on nonpartisan elections, but I am going to talk about what political scientists have basically found out about nonpartisan elections. And the general thing is they're not a good idea. In fact, to characterize most of the political science research, they're a really bad idea. So, and this is of course motivated by the fact that we have on the ballot here in Gallatin County, but not just in Gallatin County, I think up in Lewis and Clark County, I think up in Cascade County, and a couple other counties here in the state where there's going to be an initiative on the ballot to try to move county elections to be nonpartisan. And this is my plea to all of you to get out there and tell your friends and neighbors that this is a really bad idea. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why nonpartisan elections are bad, give you a little brief history of the progressive movement which brought us these nonpartisan elections, and try to convince you why political parties may not be bad. And while nonpartisan elections will do very little to, quote, cure partisanship, and in fact actually lead to detrimental democratic effects. So let's talk about the progressives. Let me paint a picture for you. Anyone seen the Gangs of New York? It's a pretty good movie, and there's this movement. There's a part there where some immigrants are coming off of a boat, and you have a machine that meets them to get them to register to vote. And you have to understand that the progressive movement grew out of a response to the immigration that was occurring in the 19th century, mid to late 19th century, and concern with immigration and the problems that immigration's brought to a lot of urban areas. The first thing you have to understand, of course, these mass immigration coming to these cities cause problems. I mean problems in terms of services, water, housing, sanitary conditions. A lot of these cities were overcrowded, didn't have the ability to respond to the social service needs in particular of immigrants coming to this country. States didn't give a lot of these cities the power and capability to handle this, the money and the resources. So what happened into this vacuum, right, there's a need. These political machines develop largely to provide these social services and to help run these cities. Now, the problem is that some of these machines certainly could be corrupt. They basically would expect in return for services the loyalty of individuals to the machine. And most importantly, for our purposes, the interests of the machines didn't always align with the interests of the upper middle class and upper class whites in the business class in these various cities. So you had here basically folks that dominated the social and political and elite class that were upset with these machines and the dominance of these machines by immigrants. And businesses became very frustrated with machine power. On top of that, there's a religious aspect. Most of the immigrants were Catholics, Catholic Germans, Catholic Irish, and then later, of course, Catholic Poles and Catholic Italians. And of course, the upper class in most of these cities were Protestant. And it was Catholics that dominated the machine politics. So the progressive movement was largely formed as a reaction by the elite against these machines to try to drive them from power. And to be fair to the progressive, to some extent, to try to administer cities along scientific lines. The idea was, look, there are scientific principles in business that we could apply to the running of cities, and that the running of cities and administration of cities should basically be governed by these scientific principles and not politics. The belief of progressives was this: parties essentially hampered the correct, and I use that in quotes, public administration of cities. So what progressives decided to do in order to gain control and try to get some power back from machines is to essentially try to undercut the power of parties and machines. And they did this by essentially passing a series of reforms, not just in cities, but in states in general. So some of the features of today's politics came out of the progressive era. Number one, something called the Australian ballot. The Australian ballot is the ballot that we use today. So you go in this fall to vote, you'll see that, number one, the state government produces the ballot, and on the ballot we have a list of the candidates for each office with their parties listed. That's not the way ballots existed in the 19th century. We had something called party strip ballots. that were produced by the parties. So in order to vote, you go to the party, they give you a ballot, it's usually colored, and on the ballot has the list of all the candidates for the party. Let's say the Democrats have a yellow ballot, Republicans have a green ballot. And what you would do is you take your ballot and you cast it in public in front of everybody into the box where, of course, the machine is looking to make sure you're casting your vote correctly. One of the features of the Australian ballot is now we're going to have a secret ballot behind a curtain, and we're going to have the government create the ballot and then administer the elections. And it was really hard to vote for a different party with those old ballots. You basically had to get two ballots, cut the names off the people you wanted, paste them on one ballot, and then vote. Of course, everyone could see it. So the idea is we create secret ballots that's going to undercut the power of the machines and going to make them less powerful, because now the machine can't basically hold you accountable to how you vote. The other thing that developed were primaries. So we want to take power away from the bosses that decide who the office holders were. We're going to have primaries and let voters make that decision. And if you let voters make that decision, you undercut the power of the machines and the bosses. The final thing is to have nonpartisan elections entirely for local government. The idea is we'll reduce the control of the party bosses by removing partisanship from the ballot entirely. And the idea, too, is that, well, decisions about trash, decisions about roads should be scientifically made and have no business being made in a partisan fashion. Now, those of you that have ever taken a class from me know one thing I always talk about is institutional changes have consequences. So in many respects, these reforms did weaken parties and did hamper party machines. But I'll tell you this, they didn't end party machines in lots of places. In fact, what really ended party machines were not these structural changes, but really a change in the federal government relationships to the states and the cities. Really, if you want to look at who ended political machines as we know them, at least from then, in the United States, it wasn't these structural changes. They hampered parties a little. What really hampered it was the New Deal. When the New Deal created and the welfare state expanded dramatically under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that's when, and the federal government basically filled the gap of the machines with the social welfare system. That structure basically ended the need for most machines and led to the downfall of most of these big, massive party machines in these big cities in the Midwest, the West Coast, and in the East. Okay, so what I'm going to do is try to defend political parties a little bit. So this is true for Republican parties, Democratic parties, Green parties, I don't care. So I'm going to tell you what political parties do. Political parties recruit candidates for office. That's an important feature of political parties. And they often simplify the process of governing. Imagine, with 435 members of Congress, if we had no political parties, how difficult it would be to try to get a coalition together on any particular issue without knowing at all where somebody might stand on the issues. It's virtually impossible. And imagine doing this from issue to issue to issue. So political parties simplify the process of governing. According to the University of Denver political scientist Seth Maskett, parties do the important organizational work in democracy. I mean, isn't that what you just started talking about when I came in the room? The things that parties need to do to basically help democracy work. He goes further and says that they are the key elements of democracy because they organize the demands of various groups and individuals and convert them into policies, something which individual voters cannot easily do. They also help bring factions together and unite them behind a common cause. But most importantly, from my perspective in this notion of nonpartisan elections and why I think they're a bad idea, is parties help voters make, and my words here are rational and informed choices. How? Well, think about decision-making processes and how we make decisions in a day, and all the decisions that we make. People are cognitive misers. We don't want to use vast amounts of energy to make decisions. We want to make decisions quickly and easily, so we use cues or heuristics to make decisions simpler and easier for us. Imagine this for a moment. How many of you went to the supermarket today? Imagine for a moment that we walk down the soup aisle. Imagine for a moment that we decide that we want to have soup for dinner. Now, here's what I don't think any of you did if you go down the soup aisle. I don't think you all went to each and every can of soup and evaluated each and every can of soup on its label to figure out what you were going to choose. Now, you might say, I want tomato soup, but even then, you're not going to be like, I'm going to look at every single can of tomato soup before making my decision. Chances are you made a choice that was rational and that used a cue or heuristic. Chances are you're like, hey, I know Progresso soups. I like Progresso soups. I've heard about them on TV. I'm going to go choose a Progresso soup. You look at the brand. What happens when you remove the brand from the soup and you have 16 cans of chicken soup? How the hell do you make a decision? It's virtually impossible. So think about this for a moment from the perspective of voters. And this is hard, I think, for those of you in the room to think about this through, because I think all of you in this room care about voting. I think all of you care about democracy. And not only that, I also suspect you probably pay a lot of attention, and a lot of attention to politics and policies. But most people don't. Most people don't make decisions in politics like we do. We're weird. They're normal. And the way they make decisions, frankly, is that they want to make decisions with cues, and they want to make them quickly, and they want to make them simply. What happens is, when voters don't have information to make choices, what do? They abstain. They choose not to vote. This is what we call ballot roll-off on ballots. Think of the ballots that we have that we go and cast. It's not a surprise that almost every single election, the highest voter turnout is for president. We have the most information to make a decision. Sometimes the Senate race will have a little bit higher turnout. It did actually in 2012 here in Montana. Voters actually cast more ballots in the Senate race, but it was also a $50, $60 million race. And there wasn't a single ad that I know of that was, man, there may be a couple in the primary aired in 2012. So if you keep going down the ballot, you go from president, Senate, governor, AG, OPI, all the way down to state legislature, and then to those poor nonpartisan elections at the back of the ballot. What do you think happens? People vote less as they go further down the ballot. The scholarship is clear on this point, folks. Nonpartisan elections are associated with voter turnout. Just to cite one article, Schaffner, Streb, and Wright, 2001, confirm this in their paper on nonpartisan ballots. And they're finding that lower turnout happens in nonpartisan elections is clear from a variety of other studies. You can go to Wright 2008 for the overview. Well, okay, that's what the research says. What about the data in Montana? 2016. Governor, 73% registered voter turnout for that race. OPI, 71%. Secretary of State, 72%. What do all those races have in common? Party labels, right? Supreme Court, 65% turnout. Let's look at another example. I did a little digging around, and I looked at the Bozeman city election that happened the same year that we had the special election for the U.S. House race. Now, I'm going to acknowledge a couple things. The U.S. House race was the most expensive race, that runoff that we had between Gianforte and Quist. The special election was the most expensive House race we've had in Montana history. Okay? There was a 58% turnout in the city of Bozeman for that race. Now, I want to put that in context. That's super high for an election that's not planned in an off year. Anyone care to guess what the turnout was in the nonpartisan elections that fall in the city commission races? Both are too high. 23%. So both, and I want to be clear, both those elections are held in unusual times, right? Because 2017 is an off election year. Now, granted, the commission races happen in November, but the key point here is we kind of had similar races held under somewhat similar conditions, except for the spending the House race, and yet we had far less turnout in the nonpartisan race. Okay, so what happens? You get rid of the partisanship. How do voters make decisions? Well, race, ethnicity, place, prestige, religion, ballot location will get you an extra 5 points. Familiarity. One of my students texted me this weekend. She's preparing for the Foreign Service exam. And I told her I was giving this talk. And this is what she said I should say at this talk about this issue of nonpartisan elections. And this is a quote. Quote, "Without cues, most people will vote for the person with the funniest name. And we don't want, for those of you who care about British politics, Lord Buckethead running anything here." Lord Buckethead, by the way, is a candidate that runs against Theresa May in her constituency and gets a certain number of votes. But notice they have party ID on the ballot in Great Britain. Nonpartisan elections aid in incumbency protection. Schaffner, Streb, and Wright find that support for the notion that, absent partisan cues, incumbency becomes an important piece of information in nonpartisan elections. That is to say that nonpartisan elections become just another way for incumbents to preserve their electoral advantage over challengers. Somebody's asked me, does nonpartisan elections affect candidate recruitment and the type of candidates that run? That seems less clear. I can't find a lot of definitive evidence on that, but I can tell you this. What tends to basically happen when you have nonpartisan elections is that parties tend to get displaced by so-called, quote, good government groups, end quote, that recruit candidates to create a machine under a very different label. How do nonpartisan elections affect policy? Again, according to Gerald Wright, quote, "The evidence suggests that the nonpartisan ballot produces governments that are less responsive to the concerns of the working class and the poor. Studies using very different methods have found a pattern of ruptured representational linkages in places that use the nonpartisan ballot," and there's all kinds of citations there. Furthermore, studies of race and ethnicity find that especially poor responsiveness to minority concerns in cities using nonpartisan ballots. And this lack of responsiveness is exacerbated in cities that also use at-large elections. The power of money. We've talked a lot about dark money here in Montana. Our governor, of course, fought it. Our governor's running his presidential campaign on it. You have nonpartisan elections, you make money more important, not less. More important because in absent of those readily available cues, creates bigger resource disparities, have more of an impact. You can spend your way to familiarity. And if you have a lot of money, you're more likely to win. Absent partisan cues. Now, another point. If my friend Chris Mell were here, and I think Chris Mell would defend nonpartisan elections, he would say this: but nonpartisan elections lead to better governing, better decisions. And in fact, Don Seifert, the county commissioner here in Gallatin County, who went up to testify in favor of this bill that allowed basically counties to put nonpartisan elections on the ballot, said, you know what? Partisanship doesn't matter when you're dealing with license plates and zoning. Now, first of all, I think that's baloney. Obviously, partisanship matters. It matters in things like, do you care about minimum wage? Do you care about how you're going to compensate your employees? Do you care about discrimination policies? Zoning matters, and how you think about zoning matters if you're a Republican or Democrat. So I just think that's ridiculous. There's a ton of city decisions that matter, depending upon your partisan mindset. Well, okay, what about the data? Craig Burnett, assistant professor at Hofstra University, recently blogged at the London School of Economics blog that he conducted a study on voting behavior of city councilors in San Diego, which, by the way, has nonpartisan elections. He analyzed the votes taken in the city council. What's the best predictor of how people vote? Their partisanship, because we still know their partisanship, even though they're nonpartisan elections, we know what it is. It's not like people check their partisanship at the city door. They're human beings. We are political creatures. So the reforms are designed to try to make things nonpartisan, but the outcomes are still partisan. To quote him, given the continued level of political segregation in the United States, districts often produce ideologically minded representatives who are going to vote on legislative matters in a partisan way. Gerrymandering and polarization up and down the electoral system of the United States only contributes to this outcome, unquote. You can't take the partisanship out of the person. They're going to behave that way when they get in the door. The problem I think people have with partisanship is not partisanship. This is something I was talking to my colleague Linda Young. They don't like teamsmanship. The idea that party above all is more important, to the point where you're actually not paying attention to reality and logic and data. Here's the greatest irony of all of this, though. Quote, voters, according to our friend Wright again, quote, say they prefer elections without party labels, but they tend to bring candidate choice into alignment with their partisanship when informed of the party affiliations of candidates running in the formally nonpartisan contests, unquote. So even if we have nonpartisan elections, most parties will endorse candidates, and if they find that information, they vote in a partisan way anyway. Most voters, whether they want to admit it or not, are closet partisans. Let's stop pretending otherwise. Nonpartisan elections are a bad idea. I think they're bad for democracy. I think they're bad for engagement of citizens. I think they're just a bad idea. So I think we should all go vote no on this issue on the ballot in November, and you should tell all your friends to do the same. That's what I got for you. Happy to take some questions.
What was the motivation for this bill to allow or promote nonpartisan elections? What was their goal?
What was the goal, was the question of the bill for these nonpartisan elections. I don't know what the goal is. I can suspect that I think that the goal might be intentionally to try to hide partisanship. So people that might be of a particular partisan inclination in a particular area or region that is not to their benefit want to be able to obscure that fact. But that's just me guessing, I think. But it's curious to note this. Don Seifert, of course, is a Republican on the county commission. And if you looked at those county elections, I think as said at the very beginning, here in Gallatin County in 2018, if you noted, Democrats kicked butt up and down the ballot. And I think there's a very good reason for that, because you had this big turnout, you had the surge against the Republican Party, you had a surge against the administration. And I think what you saw, and I would have to go back and look at this, I guarantee you the turnout on some of those lower ballot races was a lot higher than normal. So what people did is I think they chose to just punish the party straight up and down the ballot. So if I want to go further, let's go back to what I said about nonpartisan elections and protecting incumbents. I think this is a way for certain people to protect themselves, for incumbents to protect themselves against partisan movement one way or the other in general. To dispute me?
Yeah, that you're feeling that nonpartisan elections is not the way to go, and I think it is. It's in this county, and I'm only speaking for this county, because we had candidates for our county elections who were not qualified for those positions. They did not have the experience or the knowledge to do some of the elections auditing, in particular, those two. And so for me, when you've got a nonpartisan election, then you have to run on your qualifications for doing that job. You know, sheriff is another one, county attorney, obviously, and I think you get a better candidate out of a nonpartisan election than taking the chance that you have a party election that elects a non-qualified candidate. So, but I'm talking Gallatin County. You were citing things elsewhere, and this is my feeling for Gallatin County.
Well, I think, let's go back to, basically the suggestion here is here in Gallatin County that nonpartisan elections are good because nonpartisan elections mean that candidates have to run on their qualifications, and as a result, you're less likely to get candidates who are unqualified in office. I think that's a fair summation of the argument. Number one, if parties do their jobs, they should vet candidates that are well qualified, and that's better when you have strong parties that actually can help affect who gets on the ballot, one. Two, that still requires an awful lot of work for voters to figure that information out, whether they're qualified or not. So you're talking about one election at one period of time, where I'm talking about studies that cite many, many different elections over many periods of times with a lot more N. But I will say this, how many of you actively seek out information on candidates who are running for, let's say, county coroner? And this isn't a pretty astute audience. Pardon me? Well, in lots of places we do. But I'll give you another example. Let's talk about school board, okay? I will, since you gave me an anecdote, I'll give you one too. I moved to South Bend, Indiana in 2005. Thankfully, that was a short occurrence, and I moved to Bozeman, which is much, much better. You're stuck with me, guys. And I had to do, I wanted to vote in the election for school board because it was coming up 2005. So I'm like, I'm going to look up the candidates. I went to the South Bend Tribune. I tried to follow these articles. I tried to find web pages. First of all, the candidates had no web pages. I mean, it was 2005. There was still a web, right, even back then. The only thing I found was one article where they interviewed the school board candidates, and they all basically said 2 sentences about why they're running for office. And you know what they all said about, we want to make, essentially, South Bend schools great again, basically. I had no idea who the heck to vote for. The only way I figured this out at all is that I happened to go to the polling site on the day of the election, because I don't believe in voting absentee, and I ran into one of the candidates and grilled her. She gave me good answers. I voted for her. That's how I figured it out. But there was no information out there at all. At least with the party queue, I've got a good sense. Now, that's not going to be fair to your concern, that's not going to avoid every problem. But it's going to, I think, help give us some information when we make decisions. We're going to know they're probably going to have a certain set of ideas that we may or may not agree with. It's better than nothing, is the way I would put it.
Last election, the Republicans, and I'm going to name it, the Republicans ran people for elections and auditors who had absolutely no qualifications. Those were the party candidates. So I can't count on the party. They put forth a name who maybe they wanted to give them a job in the case of one candidate.
The concern was basically Republicans put some non-qualified people up, and that helped get them into office, even if they weren't qualified. And I'll counter that, then that's a problem with the party. Yes, my colleague Linda Young, who's going to grill me intensely here.
Thank you. Right, I really enjoyed your talk. I have some lingering concerns. One is, as a professor, I talk to lots of young people, and they don't identify with parties, right? I mean, the recent climate march was organized by Sunrise, which is basically organized around issues. Some young people think that parties are corrupt, and if we want them to be actively involved, I think that harking back to party identification of cues is maybe the wrong way to go. Not sure about that, but there's some evidence. Second,
I'll dispute that point in a minute, but okay.
I have 3 points. Second is that what does party identification mean right now? I mean, at least on the national level, right? I think the Republicans are confused and the Democrats are really diverse. And so to me, to say that someone's Democratic doesn't give me a solid set of cues around everything, because there's a lot of diversity within the Democratic Party right now. And finally, I wonder about the statement that you made comparing the turnout for city commission and Congress, right? Definitely, they had different turnout rates. One's partisan, one's nonpartisan, but what are the possibilities of missing variables, right? I'm not sure. There could be other factors that account for differences in the turnout besides the fact that one is partisan, one's nonpartisan.
Okay, so let's take the last concern first. Yeah, I mean, the obvious difference is there was about $20 million spent in that House race. And I think in the city commission races, we're talking, I'm looking at you all, maybe $20,000, $50,000 at most. I mean, we're not talking lots, gobs of money. That was the best apples to apples comparison I could sort of make in 2017. However, that's why I looked at the Supreme Court races here in Montana. And the Supreme Court races do spend, there's a little less money, but not actually much, about the same amount of money you would spend in OPI or AG races. And guess what? You have lower turnout in those Supreme Court races. Well, even then, what you mean, you're talking about the Wheat and Van Dyke race? Yeah, so that was a lot of money spent there. But you know what? You still had lower voter turnout. The second thing, you said young people think the parties are corrupt. And you don't think, and don't identify with parties.
They identify with the issues and they find that mobilizing.
So if you look at the data, generally speaking, most Americans will probably say that they are, quote, independent. And I would say it's probably higher among young people. But if you dig down in the data, most people lean. And among most people, only about 12% of the population at best is called, quote, independent. And if you're, quote, independent, do you know what that means? You're non-voter. You don't pay attention. You don't engage. So I would disagree. I mean, the data is clear that even young people, they're generally going to associate one party or the other. Now, it could also mean that we need to have different parties. I don't dispute that. What does it mean to be a Republican or a Democrat? That was your other concern. Well, actually, in some respects, it's easier to say more than today, in this era now, what it means to be a Democrat or Republican, and it's much more clearer, and there's actually far less diversity ideologically among the parties today than, say, in 1950 or 1960 or 1970. In fact, the parties have dramatically polarized. Now, we can talk about the good or ill of all of that, but at the end of the day, the amount of heterogeneity ideologically, you know, the variation among Democrats and Republicans, has decreased markedly since 1975. So if anything, it's much clearer what it means to be a Republican and much clearer, to at least ideologically, it means to be a Democrat. Now, I'm going to give some ground, because I have one reluctance about everything I said here today. And this goes back to the issue of teamsmanship. I'm reading a book right now by Liliana Mason, which basically came out of her dissertation. She's a professor at the University of Maryland. And the one thing that does concern me today about our party system is what's called well-sorted parties and partisanship. And what she finds very interesting in this book is that it's not issues among voters that's driving this, how shall I put it, this disagreement between individuals of different parties, but more the idea that people are socially sorted together in ways consistent with partisanship, so people see themselves as part of a team. Think about this in terms of sports, right? I'm a Red Sox fan, I get this, right? And I can't stand Yankees fans. What's happened in this country because of sorting, and what I mean by sorting is, think about it this way. Republicans are increasingly looking older, white, male, from certain areas of the country. Democrats looking increasingly not white, urban, younger. What's happening is people are now seeing themselves as part of these teams, and as they're sorted socially, they're more likely to then protect their team against attacks from the other side. And that's bad. And in fact, she makes the argument that it'd be far better to have parties that had people that are socially different within the party. Think African American Republican, Neil Young, Love from Utah. And that would actually diminish some of the intensity of the debates and discussions that go on between parties of various stripes in the United States. So, but that's a person problem, and I don't know if we could fix that, but I don't think moving to nonpartisan elections would fix that at all.
So in your research,
This is not my research. This is me
not-
summarizing research.
But yeah, anyway, in your studies and what you've looked at over the years, have you noticed a causative or correlative relationship between the scarcity mindset and participation in government? Meaning, so right now, there's this. So many people in our society are just struggling to get by, right? So the scarcity mindset, meaning that if you are struggling just to survive, then you don't have time to be politically active. Anyway, I'm curious if you've noticed that.
The literature on political participation is very clear, is that people that have more resources are more likely to be engaged in parties, politics and politics in general. So if you have more time, if you're richer, all these things, you're more likely to engage, period. And you know what else? You're also more likely to engage if you're a strong partisan where your identities are all the same. You're more likely to participate than someone whose identities conflict with your partisanship. So well-sorted partisans are much more likely to engage in politics than people who are not well-sorted. And that means that you have the most ideologically extreme, potentially, and people that see party politics as an attack on somebody on their team and attacking the other team, they're more likely to be engaged as well. But it's very true. Long-standing research on this says the more resources you have, the less scarcity that you experience, the more likely you are to participate. So more educated people participate, more educated people vote, but they're also more likely to donate. Again, same thing with richer people. The more resources you have, the more you engage.
So David, you commented several times that money was a better predictor of turnout in some abstract sense. So would you view it as a much more meaningful or effective approach to have public financing and strong campaign limits so that the playing field of money is more even?
So one of the things that's really fascinating, and Dr. Young and I have long had a history together talking about things like Citizens United. I've long been a proponent in the past that I think Citizens United was not a horrible decision, and that's really hard to say among a bunch of Democrats, right? You're all going to eat me alive. Because one of the long-standing things that we know is that the more money you have in electioneering, the better informed candidates are and the more participation occurs, period. I mean, so the turnout in that House race, that special election, which, remember, this is hard. It's a May election. It's an unusual time. It's not expected. Was 58%. So in many ways, that's ginormous. Well, it's because of money, because the amount of money that came in on this race. And so the one thing I'm very clear on is that actually we don't need less money in politics. We need more. Okay? That's also scary to say that. I think we need more money on these local city races. More money needs to be spent. But this is where I'll come around. The problem with Citizens United, let's go back to the findings about partisanship, right? You get the wackiest people engaging in politics that have no allegiance to political institutions. So what happens is you have people like the Koch brothers that care about their own ideological world that are putting a lot of money into these races, and you're not having corporations like GE, who actually in many respects might be reasoned in their approach, and this is a problem on the right and the left. So what that tells me is that Citizens United is a problem because you can get all kinds of people that hide under corporate shells who have no accountability, spending tons of money trying to affect politics and basically do things, and it's true, the data also shows, go to the Wesleyan Media Project. Money spent by outside groups is almost 100% negative and not positive, whereas candidate spending tends to be more of a mix. So what I will say this is I advocate for more money in politics. But, number one, all that money's got to be disclosed, period, end of discussion. The second thing is maybe it might mean putting overall caps and maybe having both sides have relatively equal resources. I'm not entirely convinced I want to have public financing, but I think the system needs to be changed from what we have right now. I don't think it's healthy to have a lot of people hiding and creating these shell organizations and dumping a lot of money when they don't have any understanding of place and they don't have allegiance to political systems or even particular places. That bothers me.
So I don't know if you want to, I have a question at the end of this, but I don't know if you want to talk about more parties. I think about engaging youth, nonpartisan versus partisan ballots, when you have more than just an R and a D on a ballot, maybe more fine-grained parties that represent different types of views that make younger people who feel they have different views than traditional Republicans or Democrats might make them feel more engaged. That to me sounds like it would argue for more against nonpartisan ballots. And I think it's interesting what's happening in Israel. I think it was very interesting what happened in a recent British Columbia election. You know, the traditional parties were pretty much even, and it was 3 seats of the Green Party that basically allowed them to form a government. So you could argue the Green Party had an outsized influence. On the other hand, you could argue that everybody who voted for the Green Party all of a sudden had a pretty good voice, and I would think that would lead to higher levels of engagement. So that's my wandering around about more parties. I think it's a pipe dream in this country right now. But my question goes all the way back to the beginning, which is, for folks in the Montana legislature who supported allowing counties to do nonpartisan, or to put nonpartisan elections in front of people, was that a partisan result? In other words, was that a bipartisan support for that bill, or did it split along party lines?
I'm not familiar with the vote, but we have someone here who might know something about it.
Hi, let me take that one here. I'll give you back here. Thank you. Hi, I'm Representative Kimberly Dudick. I actually looked up the vote count on that because I was curious. I did vote on this bill, and I wanted to know why after listening to what you talked about. And we actually it was a coalition of all the Democrats and the moderate Republicans, and this bill was brought by a moderate Republican, and it passed 84-13, 83-14 in the House, and 30-20 in the Senate. So it passed on with the coalition who's been actually able to get things done, the Solutions Caucus and the Democrats. But the reason we passed it was because we were of the opinion that this would actually help get some of these smaller towns where people just vote straight R and they don't even care who's qualified and who it is, but that these places may be able to change their rules and actually get some more progressive or more democratic people there who aren't of the Republican Party. So and we were given information that is what would happen. So with that information, that's why we took these votes, and they were overwhelmingly like all Democrat and the moderate Republicans. And I voted for both of them, so yes.
I would love to see that data because I think it's fanciful, but okay. I mean, but yeah, so in this case, overwhelmingly bipartisan to go to nonpartisan elections, which is kind of weird to say, bipartisan to go to nonpartisan, but okay.
Back to this lady's question about local offices for auditor, coroner, treasurer, surveyor, et cetera. I would propose that those maybe should be professional positions, professional career positions that aren't elected at all.
I would agree. I would go for that. I'd rather have professional positions than actually have them be elected in a nonpartisan fashion. And in fact, I mean, I'm old school and from New Hampshire. This whole notion of judicial elections befuddles me. Judges should be appointed. Sorry.
Several of those positions do have requirements for qualifications.
I work in Gallatin County, and I've worked with a lot of the local elected officials. It's been my experience both as a person who is engaged in politics and as a government employee that most of the people I talk to outside of the government for local elections have no idea what these positions even do. They have no idea what an auditor does. They don't know what the clerk and recorder is. They have nothing. And the only thing they're voting on is whether it's an R and a D. And if they don't know, either they listen to me because they're a friend of mine, or they don't vote at all. So, I mean, to some extent, and that's about the extent of the information that they're going to gather. They're not going to look past the column on whether the R or the D or the incumbent. Several of those positions do have qualifications, but it does not seem to matter in turnout in my experience. So my question to you, after I've just pontificated here, but my question to you is, if this does pass, how do you think going forward people should, like, what resources could they use, or what could the parties do to get that information out to the public that are choosing to vote?
The parties should, frankly, endorse candidates and get out information and put stuff on the website and do everything they can to basically tell them that they think these are the candidates that best suit the idea of the Democratic or Republican Party. I want to build actually your quote pontification, which I took as a friendly amendment, was great, and here's why. I don't think you understand how much we vote here in the United States compared to other countries. Not only do we vote a lot, we vote for everything. And you know who is partly to blame for that? The progressives. Because of this desire, this idea that democracy is going to solve it all. But compared to a lot of other countries, most other countries don't vote for this many positions up and down the ballot, and they don't vote as often. We could debate whether it's good or bad. But for example, in Britain, you might have an election for 5 years, whereas we seem to have elections like all the time, not just midterms, presidentials, and then these off-year elections. We're always going to the ballot box. So you could argue there's some democratic exhaustion that can happen in the United States as well. You're asking people to make lots of decisions frequently. So that's just my point there.
Doesn't that make them more involved than just sitting at home and just letting the world go by?
Does what make them more involved?
The number of elections and what we're electing for.
Well, the United States has low voter participation compared to other countries that tend to vote less. So we're, presidential election, we're around 60%, which is relatively higher than it's been in history. But historically, like you go back to 2000, voter turnout was about 50% of voting age population. Starting about 2004, it's been roughly 60-ish%. But in other countries, we're talking more 70, 80%.
I do have a question about the younger voters. When we try to register voters, and I'm speaking more high school graduates not going on to college, working young people, we have a real time trying to get them to register, just even register, let alone a vote. And I don't know why that particular class of people are so resistant. Have you anything?
Yeah, I can tell you why. Let's go back to the scarcity argument. Younger voters tend to be the most transient, right? They move a lot. They tend to be focused on having families, building careers. Their bandwidth is very, very low for other activities. They tend to have less invested in the community because they're so transient. So first of all, yeah, younger voters are less likely to vote. Absolutely. They get older, guess what? They get more invested, they learn more about a place, they own a home, they have more of a stake in community. Guess what happens to voter registration and turnout? It goes up. Now, I should say, when I teach Inter-American government, I look at everyone and I say, you damn well better vote. And frankly, I show them the effects very clearly of the fact that they don't vote. And I look at them and I say, look, no, I don't want to disparage older people in this room because I'm rapidly approaching that age as well. Things like Social Security are important. But Social Security is never touched because older people vote. But you know what does get touched? Tuition, student loans, because who cares? I spoke off the record. Well, no, it was on background, so I can share this, but I can't say who it was. It was with a Republican consultant many years ago when I was researching a book project. He said, we don't care about young voters. Waste time, effort, resources. They don't show up. Why should we waste our time?
I've heard that.
It costs a lot to just think about the time and effort it costs to basically register a young voter versus getting an old person to show up. It's sad.
Can I ask a different question?
Are we talking about impeachment now?
No. You said something about absentee ballots. That was intriguing to me because I am a huge fan of absentee ballots. As a single working parent of 2 children, going to the ballot box on election day was just not feasible for many years. Why do you feel that it's more important that people show up and actually physically vote versus sitting down at their kitchen table with their ballot?
I don't like absentee voting for a couple different reasons, and probably the best evidence of that happened, the election night in 2017 here in Montana, where a certain somebody who will go unnamed beat up a reporter. We had new information that came at the last minute that maybe if so many absentee ballots had not been cast, maybe that election might have been a little closer or gone a little differently. So from my own standpoint, I like to have as much information as I can before I vote, period. I know many people have their decisions made up well in advance, but for me, I want everything I can. 2, I think it's important for democracy to experience it together. I think it's a social activity. We're a stronger democracy if we engage in this wonderful thing that we do as a community in a place and cast ballots together. So for me, maybe I'm lucky because I can do that. But I like taking my kids with me to the polls, and I like seeing them watch how democracy works. And for me, that's way outweighs the convenience of sitting at my kitchen table to vote. I'd much rather do that and hang out with my neighbors. We're too isolated today, and I like to see different people and talk to them. And I just think democracy is an exercise in togetherness. And that's me being a little misty-eyed.
In your opinion, what does drive lower voter turnout in the United States versus other countries? It seems like it's across the board.
What drives lower voter turnout in the United States versus other countries? I mean, I could give you lots of possible reasons. One is some structural issues. So in other countries, it's easier to register to vote. Some other countries, it's required to vote. Some other countries, you're automatically on the ballot. You're already registered, and you don't have to go and register. Some here in the United States, some of it has to do with longstanding structural issues in the South and racism. Some of it has to do with the fact that our country is more diverse than these other countries, and because of the legacy of racism in the United States. Some people have argued that part of it is a lot of people are, quote, more content here, so they're less likely to be angry to go and vote. I'm not sure I buy that anymore. So there are lots of reasons. Some countries have national holidays. I mean, there are all kinds of other factors as opposed to why.
Thank you. I had a question about talking about population size. If you're talking about a large county like Gallatin County as compared to a very small county where you have, if it's an election and it is nonpartisan, 2 new candidates, so they aren't incumbents. Do you think that that plays differently with the facts you're talking about who people will vote for and how likely it is that you'll actually get the most qualified candidate?
I have no information one way or the other to give you an answer on that. The only thing I can say is that voter turnout tends to be a lot higher in these smaller rural counties, and I suspect it has something to do with the fact that people know each other and there's a tighter community. Whereas here in Bozeman, you can be relatively anonymous, and not be around your neighbors and stuff like that. Although, I'd be interested to know what quote counts as more qualified. I mean, we could theoretically test this. If we could come up with some sort of definition of what well qualified is and kind of look. I mean, it could be done. So if any of you want to do that in your spare time or talk to some students to do that. Cameron? No. Cameron's shaking his head. No. And my research plate is full. No questions about the UK or impeachment? Wow. Not that I'd be able to answer them.
So I'd like to ask you a question about something you're probably really familiar with, and that is the disinterest of college students. Earlier when you were talking about the elections in 2017, the special election between Quist and Gianforte, and then the local election that came later, and just the abysmal voter turnout comparatively. Because we're in election season right now for city positions and such, and I have a tough time convincing college students to go vote for that simply because I find Bozeman's city election structure to be really confusing, and I want to tell people.
Who's our mayor? We have a deputy mayor for a period of time, and then mayor. I mean, it confuses me.
Right, like it sounds like I'm describing some clan from Lord of the Rings trying to pick the next chief or something like. And especially when you were talking earlier about how people vote like a lot at the top of the ballot and not so much for Supreme Court seats and things like that. Is that disinterest really a bad thing? I mean, because I would rather have people who are familiar with the candidates like voting, that they actually do that rather than just this presumed partisan stooge that we're talking about that just goes down the ballot and just looks for a letter one way or the other. So I guess I'm just saying that like the people who are interested in voting the election like actually get out there and vote. And if like things just need to be professional appointee anyways, then it doesn't really sound like it matters one way or the other. And I just wondered if you would like to speak to that.
The smaller the number of people that vote, the more likely you're going to have just outcomes that are distortive of the majority will. End of story. So I want to have more and more people voting, period. The great irony about all this is one thing I tell my students. I said, what's really strange and weird here? Think about this logically for a moment. Where is your vote most valuable? Not for president. It's here in Bozeman. You have a hell of a lot more power with your one vote, and yet people vote at lower rates in local elections. Not only that, you have a more effect on your daily existence. Period. I mean, yes, all this stuff that's going on in Washington, D.C. is interesting, but let's be perfectly honest here. On our day-to-day lives, how much does it really matter how much Donald Trump is doing whatever he's doing in the White House, or Barack Obama, or whomever? Not a heck of a lot, but it does matter about how your roads are doing, whether they're getting paved, whether the snow's being removed, whether or not you got garbage collection, whether or not you can get to school on time because of traffic congestion, whether or not the lights are working. All those things affect you. Or whether or not you're getting water coming into your tap, whether or not your sewer system's working, whether or not your water's clean. Yeah, the EPA's got something to do with that, but at the end of the day, it's the systems and structures that are here locally that matter. And yet, we vote less. That is bizarre. So, what I would say to the student is said, do you like drinking nice water? Do you like having a shower? Do you like having roads to get to or bike lanes so you can get to school? Well, duh, vote, damn it. Vote locally. And even tell them, don't vote for president, vote locally. Vote for the people running for the city council. That's where you can affect the most change. And you know, a state legislature. You talk about these house districts that have about, what, 8,000 people maybe that live in them? Oh my goodness, you have incredible power. Some of those races, you know, be by 20 votes, 30 votes, 100 votes. That doesn't happen at the presidential level. I mean, especially here in Montana. I mean, heck, the last time this state was kind of close was 2008, where Barack Obama made a good go of it and almost won the state. But they have to go all the way back to 1992 when Bill Clinton won here in Montana, and that's because of Ross Perot, who took a lot of votes. So vote local. And eat local, I guess. I don't know.
One more quick question. Civics in, say, high school, grade school, or middle school, over the past 50 years or so, can you speak somewhat to how much importance what importance that's had and how that's changed over that time period?
I can't, and part of the reason I don't know I can't even tell you what civics is like here in Montana. I live in New Hampshire. We had a civics class. We took civics, it was required, but is that not, I don't think that's true here in Montana. You don't have to take a civics class quite the same way. So I can't tell you about the effect of civics instruction. I mean, I could say this, there's some suggestion and possibility that part of the reason voters are really cynical and apathetic is because of education. Because my job is actually make you critical and cynical. And it's true, you look at this, is that the higher education levels go up, there tends to be much more cynicism and less trust in Congress, for example. That's about all I can say there.
So Parker, do you
Do you care to comment either on impeachment or the latest news in Britain? I'd be interested in either or both.
I will comment briefly. The first thing I tell students, and Cameron knows this, the problem with impeachment, we have an N of 3. So if you're going to ask me what the heck's going to happen, I don't know. Other than I can tell you that we have a much more polarized and sorted nation, so it's going to be a lot harder, I think, for an impeachment proceeding to conclude with a trial that would lead to a removal. We never had it. But I will say about impeachment is this. You need to look at certain people to see how Republicans are feeling. So don't pay attention to Lindsey Graham, who's up for re-election and has to look like he's feeding the Trump base. Look at some of the senators who are retiring. Look at Lamar Alexander. Look at someone who's not retiring but probably ran his last race, was Chuck Grassley, the former Judiciary Chair. Look at somebody like Lisa Murkowski. Look at somebody like the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Richard Burr. So if you looked at Mitt Romney and what he said on Twitter, he is concerned. And Mitt Romney's important. His ideological soulmates, I could maybe envision voting for to convict in an impeachment trial. But the only way that a removal would happen is you'd have another 10 votes, and they'd have to come for people like Burr that are a bit more conservative. But the most important thing about the impeachment is this. It's not just how watch who's talking but who's not. And the other thing to watch is, this is an inquiry. Remember, go back to Watergate for a moment, where I was technically alive, but barely. And if you go back to the Watergate hearings, that was a very long process, right? I mean, the break-in happened in 72. You had hearings throughout 73. And it wasn't until August of 74 that Richard Nixon resigned. And really, kind of the big action didn't happen until the tapes came out late. I think it was like April, March of 1974. So the inquiry will go well beyond, I think, than just this one incident with Ukraine. And if you just look at the memorandum of conversation, there are lots of things going on there. I can say this. It's kind of weird speaking to Democrats since I was once a Republican and worked in Republican Party politics. But I will say this. As a former Republican, someone who's a screaming independent now, doesn't really like either party, ironically, I will say that I am disgusted by the Republican elected officials who aren't concerned about our republic and what's been going on in the White House from day one, certainly with Ukraine. This is bad, Nixon plus bad. But we'll see what happens. I think if Republicans feel that they're better off getting rid of Trump and Pence, you'll see a quick movement. As for the UK, wow. I was telling my British politics students who took my class, they're like, you never talked about the Supreme Court. It's because the Supreme Court was only created in 2009. It's not important. And yet, they had an important decision that happened 2 days ago. And the way I want you to think about the decision is this. The decision basically said that Parliament is sovereign. You have to understand that the Supreme Court made a decision that the advice a minister, in this case the Prime Minister, who's not only in Parliament but also in the executive, made was incorrect and violated parliamentary sovereignty. So the court acted to protect parliamentary sovereignty, which is supreme in the British system. As to what's going to happen, I'm on less sure ground there, other than I think there's going to have to be an election that needs to happen soon. Because the fundamental problem in Britain, and the reason why it's a mess, is that there is no governing majority right now in Parliament. And that system cannot work without a majority, period. And the other reason this is a mess is that you had something happen where Parliament wasn't basically acting as a lawmaking body. They basically told the people to do that, and now they're implementing the people's decision, which is really, really hard to do. So part of the reason the system is screwy right now is they're asked to implement a really hard thing, and there's no majority and no clear path existing within Parliament for how to do that. And the government in power essentially has no governing legitimacy, because they don't have the votes. So it's a mess. And the reason it's a mess is not just all of that, but it's really David Cameron's fault. because he passed this piece of legislation called the Fixed Terms Parliament Act. It used to be that the Prime Minister could call an election by a snap of the fingers. He can't do that anymore. He needs Parliament to vote on it. If Boris Johnson could call a darn election, he could hopefully, or somebody, he or somebody could get a government majority and do something. But there isn't right now. That's a system where the party system is collapsing before our eyes, and the deck chairs are being shuffled. It's kind of fascinating to watch. I'm not sure the Labour Party is going to survive this. I'm not sure the Conservative Party is going to survive this in its current form. I'm kind of geeking out a little bit about that, I must admit. Maybe even a bit more than what's going on in the U.S. right now.
Going back to the Brexit, what's the chance that it actually reunites Ireland?
Well, I'll tell you this. If the talk is that I've heard, which is that Boris Johnson basically wants to essentially jettison the backstop and create this agricultural union in Ireland, I think the chances are very high. In fact, arguably, perhaps the most elegant solution to the Brexit issue would be to not worry about Northern Ireland and let them unify. Because that's the problem. I mean, this is the irony of British politics. It all goes back to Ireland. Everything screwy right now in British politics is because of Ireland. And it's all because of the backstop arrangements that the party doesn't like and the DUP doesn't like, that the whole Brexit thing is being held up. I also think that the probability of Scotland becoming independent has increased dramatically as well. We might see in the next 20 years the complete collapse of the United Kingdom as we know it. And I have a Union Jack in my house. This does make me happy. Guess we're good. Thank you.
Thank you.